This is Twit.
A couple, 3 days ago, there was an AnandTech story actually that talked about Huawei cheating in benchmarks. Now, they were doing testing on the 970, not the 980, because the 980 is not out yet. But they found that in some graphics tests, specifically in some gaming tests, that the 970 was, yeah, you can scroll to that second graph there, shows you an idea of the performance delta in quote cheating mode and non-cheating mode.
Whoa.
And they were basically they were detecting when a benchmark was happening, and they would let it use a higher thermal dissipation than they would otherwise. Right. So instead of using 4.5 watts, they'd use 8 watts of power, which obviously in a short run test is, it's usable, right? Like you can
Right.
do that. The phone didn't catch on fire, the battery didn't explode or something like that. But it's not
Always
realistic
plus.
because it's not what somebody's going to do when they're actually gaming, right? It's going to be
Right.
limited. And what this tweet that I sent out was not about the AnandTech story that kind of started the discussion down there, but it was actually FutureMark, which is now UL Benchmarks, delisted some Huawei phones from their 3D Mark and other benchmarks because of this. The P20 Pro, the Nova 3, and the Honor Play results were removed because of that graph that you see there. Basically, they did their own internal testing, and they created a different version of the app that basically presented itself to the operating system differently so that it wouldn't be detected by the custom OS on Huawei's phones. It was running the exact same workloads, but you can see the huge drop. You get a score of 2988 going down to 1930, for example, in these particular scores. And that's a big deal for them. And these benchmark companies, especially somebody like UL, who's been around forever, they depend on their ratings and the fairness of their tests to be accurate. And this was not the case. So they pulling devices like this is a pretty significant move for them. They sent out an email blast, linked to their rules and regs for manufacturers to follow. They talk about
Right.
detection and optimizations forbidden, and it was an impressive move on their part to do it, and I think a little bit damaging. Now maybe not a little bit, but pretty damaging for Huawei and the Kirin line, especially since they just made a big announcement about all these performance claims on
Right.
their new chip, and now you kind of go, well, I guess we'll wait and see if that turns out to be the case.
Well, this level of cheating on a benchmark is something I haven't even heard of since like back in the Sid Davis benchmark days. And those benchmarks were really insane because they had a huge influence on what PC Mag used to call brand specifiers, people who made the decisions at large companies or in a house. And two, they spent a tremendous amount of money. They were this industry standard at the time. I mean, I literally was offered. It was a month before I realized it. When I sort of played the conversation back in my head and was like, wait a minute, that person just offered me $500,000 for a beta copy of the benchmark so they could prep their machines. Basically, and what they would do as soon as the benchmarks would release, everybody from Dell and Micron and Gateway and all these other PC companies that have been gone for a long time, they would have their teams would sit down and rage through configurations till they figured out which ones did the best jobs for the given benchmarks. And the upside of that was the benchmarks were actually based on real world applications, real world applications that would not use up a single core on a contemporary processor, but back in the day they were pretty challenging. And it was incredibly competitive. And some of the graphics benchmarks we call people were caught cheating. Basically, and this is a relatively brute force, inelegant way of doing it. Like a benchmark is running on the upside, it's doing it. They're not actually like lying and substituting information, but they are creating an unrealistic performance expectation. At least if you think you should be able to run at that performance for less than the X number of seconds the benchmark takes.
It's very similar. If you go back, if you go back 15, 18 years, there was ATI was caught cheating back in the day. It was the Quake Quack thing. Do you remember this?
Oh, yeah.
where, Quake was the big benchmark, right? And Quake 3. And what they did was they did some optimizations specific for that game that lowered the quality of some of the texture maps or the anisotropic filtering at the time that was very important. And because it was a time demo and it ran very fast. So it was hard for any person watching it to really see that the quality. Right, exactly. So what happened was people realized if you just simply rename the executable from Quake 3 to Quack 3 and did it, you would have significant impact on performance. And that's when people started to realize what was happening, and they went back and changed things, and it's a whole different world. And this is incredibly unfortunate. It's good that there are people out there checking for it. It's good that there are benchmark companies that are holding people, their feet to the fire and taking them to task for these types of things. And it's something to watch for and keep an eye on as we move forward. We can think everything is above board and that we've solved all problems, but clearly not the case.
It's disappointing and it's frustrating. You'd think this isn't happening anymore, but apparently it still is. But there's people want to be competitive. There's money to be made. They want an advantage in the marketplace. And the reality is most people aren't really stressing their hardware in a way that they would kind of be able to, manually detect the difference in performance. But I props to the benchmarking company for, really shutting the door down on this and trying to make it, to, keep it as a legitimate benchmark tool.